Owning a home used to be part of what it meant to be Australian. A house, a yard, a family, and a future. But now, that's seen as almost a myth for the young generations. We're being told it's normal, that it's just inflation, that it's always been hard. But deep down, every Aussie knows this isn't just hard, it's broken. We're at a point where decent jobs and smart savings aren't enough. You can work 50 hours a week, live modestly, skip holidays, and still be light years away from owning a home. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what's happening to Australia's housing market and why the excuses you keep hearing don't actually stack up. You'll hear a couple different others in this video as we look at the real numbers behind the housing shortage, the generational divide, and how the Aussie dream got crushed by policies, systems, and decisions that benefit the few. And if we're going to fix it, we need to be brutally honest about it, which is what we'll do in this video. If you ever felt like the system's rigged, you're right, and we're about to prove it. To support us, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or Patreon, or see our new merch line, links in the description below.
We as a nation now have what many consider to be the most insane example of an artificially inflated housing market in the world. Before 2008, we already had one of the worst housing markets internationally. Now it's even worse. The sheer increase in population within the nation has grown so rapidly that all public estimates from beyond 30 years ago pertaining to growth are now underestimates, and by a huge margin. For example, intergenerational reports up until the early 2000s drastically underestimate the population of the country from the mid-2000s onwards. Some of these reports underestimate population growth by millions in their projections. When Australia hit 27 million people not too long ago, for example, this superseded estimates from 30 years ago, which projected Australia's net population to be 23 million by the year 2020. Needless to say, they were wrong. The importance of these projections and their accuracy cannot be understated. The housing market is a slow-moving machine, and estimates are necessary to accommodate for change. Since the nation has consistently undergone rapid demographic changes over the past decade or so, it has thrown off basically every projection which used pre-existing data from the 90s and early 2000s, for example. As a result, in 2023, the HIA estimated, in a damning report they published, a huge housing deficit in the coming years. They note that roughly 205,000 houses need to be built annually to keep supply on parity with demand between 2024 and 2050. They note that in 2023, Australia commenced the development of just 175,000 new dwellings, a considerable shortfall. Thus, statistically, Australia already has a housing deficit in the many thousands. A number of attributes all play into this, some of which are abundantly obvious to all of us at this point, and others probably more subtle. Some of the obvious drivers include mass migration. Between January and December 2024, it is estimated that over 500,000 new migrants arrived in Australia with explicit goals of residing long-term, alongside another 500,000 or so people who entered temporarily under various umbrella skill exchange or student programs from India. Australia has various agreements with India. All these people need a dwelling, these people need houses, and even taking into account the roughly 500,000 long-term residents who have arrived, it doesn't take a genius to conclude that our current housing development numbers do not match up even close. Other more subtle reasons also driving up housing prices include an unparalleled decrease in marriage rates amongst actual Australians, paired with an abnormal cultural pressure for children to move out of the home after school. Both of these together lead to a dramatic increase in single-person dwellings, again accelerating the housing deficit. The result of all of this is a market so heavily inflated that median housing prices in major cities are in the 7 digits. Sydney, for example, has a median housing price of above 1.5 million, and the other cities follow closely in suit. To look at something a little bit different, returning to an earlier point, an introspective issue, an issue we can all look at, is the rise in single-person dwellings. This is a uniquely Australian problem. It's also a social and cultural problem, not just an economic problem. While mass migration is undeniably having the biggest impact on the housing market, statistically, the growth in these single-person dwellings is highly abnormal, historically speaking. In 1971, the HIA reports that 14% of dwellings were single-person, while in 2024 it was reported to have jumped to 31%. In contrast, in 1971, 41% of houses had 4 or more people dwelling, while today that number has dropped to just 29%, with most, presumably, being migrant families who make up that 29%. Again, this statistical anomaly is a result of a few things. The first is a dramatic and highly abnormal drop-off in marriage rates. This is of course a huge issue because less people, less Australians are actually having children, less are having families, and the fertility rate in this country, which is actually better than most Western countries, is still below replacement. Replacement TFR is 2.1. Our country, if I am correct, is about 1.5. And most of that is being held up by immigrants. Hence why I'd say this is not just an economic issue, this is a social and cultural issue as well. But regardless, the second issue is the fracturing of family-oriented living. Family-oriented living has been supplanted, instead today laying emphasis on pushing children out of the house after school, despite the vast majority usually not possessing a well-paying job or possibility of entering a marriage. They can't buy houses, they're not getting married. This second issue seems to have emerged alongside the boomer generation, whose economic stability and certainty of close-knit community support enabled young people at that time to move out early, while still realistically being able to afford purchasing a house and basically having the guarantee of entering into a marriage if needed. Today, this trend continues, as it has been ingrained culturally, despite it offering not only zero benefit, but rather cursing individuals to a type of indentured servitude. Well, not technically. Today, this individualist approach of splitting up families into singular units, economic units, is highly counterproductive. Not only does it drive up demand and lower supply, it also multiplies the financial strain on each individual. This is because finance amongst white Australians is now gauged solely around the individual atomized from those around him, rather than the family unit, meaning expenditures are calculated in isolation. To their credit, migrant families rarely, if ever, do this, instead choosing to pool together their resources and minimize unnecessary spending, viewing finance through the lens of the family collective. Given our situation, the harsh reality is that the immigrant model of living and finance, which means keeping families under generally the same umbrella for payments, financially supporting one another and so on, is ironically probably the best approach to take until we see a positive shift in our economy. So, to summarize this point, the Australian housing market in retrospect has been suffering for decades. Long described as the second worst housing market in the world, or in the Western world, after Ireland. After the 2008 financial crisis, we were perhaps the only nation in the West which didn't face a major housing recession. The Labor government at the time took credit for this. They championed it as a win due to various policies and stuff like quantitative easing. In reality, it was the opposite of a victory. The bubble did not burst, and the market did not correct itself in response. Note that this was before mass migration even got bad. Thus, needless to say, mass migration has multiplied the strain on the system many times over. We now have what is considered arguably the worst, most artificially unaffordable housing market in the world. And the sad thing is, even if mass migration is reversed with remigration, we still have a very long way to go to bring the housing market back into order.
Let's now talk about some of the biggest myths around why housing prices in Australia have exploded and prove why these myths are not true. If you're under 35, chances are you've been told it's just inflation. I've heard so many boomers and the older people in Gen X say that it's just inflation. It's just the dollar losing value, mate. It's normal. But that is definitely not the whole truth. In fact, it's barely part of the truth. Since the year 2000, inflation in Australia has gone up 94%, but house prices, they've gone up over 400% in most capital cities. And in Sydney, it's closer to 500%. So let's put some real numbers to this so you can see how warped it's become. Back in 1985, the average full-time wage in Australia was around $19,000, and the median house price in Sydney was about $75,000. That's roughly 4 times the annual income. Tough, but achievable. People could save a deposit in a few years, especially with stable jobs and a lower cost of living. Fast forward to 2025 and the national full-time earnings median is around $67,500 according to the ABS. But the median house price in Sydney is now approaching $1.7 million. That's over 25 times the average income. Let that sink in. Wages have increased about just over 3.5 times, but house prices have skyrocketed more than 22 times. Even if you're earning decent money, you're still falling behind, and fast. And it's not just Sydney. Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, they're all marching in the same direction. So no, it's not just inflation. If it was, wages in houses would have risen at the same rate, but they didn't, not even close. And another myth is interest rates dropped, so of course prices went up. I mean, there's a small element of truth there, partly, but interest rates were low in places like Japan, and they didn't see anywhere near to the same extent of the housing explosion like we have. Why? Well, probably because they didn't flood the housing market with foreign investors and unchecked migration. We're constantly told, just save harder, you're spending too much on Uber Eats, or our generation had it tough too. Heard that one a few times. But the reality is, no, you didn't. The economy you bought into is not the economy that we're trying to survive in. You bought a house when they were 4 times your wage, not 25 times. Today's Aussies aren't just lazy. A lot of them actually are budgeting, working side hustles, skipping holidays, and still getting nowhere because the system has moved the goalposts. It's not about entitlement, it's about fairness, and we're being fed lies to cover for a broken system. The truth seems to be that the housing market didn't just go up, it was pushed up by policy and by design. Record migration with no matching supply, foreign ownership loopholes, government incentives that pump more money into a broken system. These are real levers, and every one of them is man-made. If it were just inflation, young Australians wouldn't be locked out of the home ownership, while older generations watch their properties 5x in value. This isn't an accident, it's a system. And the longer we pretend it's just the economy or the market doing its thing, the longer we keep getting crushed by it. So don't be ignorant and don't be gaslighted. It's a housing system rigged to reward those who already own, and in return, young Aussies can't even own homes in their own country.
In this part of the video, I mainly wanted to compare the housing experience between Generation X and Generation Z, more so between the 2000s and the 2020s. The Generation X experience of saving up, buying, and even renting a home are vastly different to those of the Generation Z. In my case, for example, my parents were middle class and they worked blue-collar jobs. My mother worked random retail jobs and my father was an electrician. Together, they raised a family of 5 with 3 kids and were able to afford a home with 4 bedrooms, a backyard, and a pool with money to spend. Compare that to the first year when I moved out of home back in 2021. I paid $430 per week in rent for a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, small townhouse apartment in Brisbane. Over the past 20 years, the housing market has changed drastically, and expectations for Generation Z when owning or renting a home are vastly different to those of their parents. In 1994, the average house price was approximately $133,000, with an average wage of $27,000. Fast forward to 2025, and the average home costs $1 million, while the average salary stands at about $100,000. Once a symbol of success and security, the great Australian dream of home ownership is slipping out of reach for many. Home ownership peaked in the 1960s, but has since declined steadily over the years. This decline in home ownership is particularly concentrated in young people, those in Gen Z. This indicates a significant intergenerational disparity in housing accessibility, with most of Gen Z parents owning or being able to rent a home without any financial strain.
We've shown you the numbers, the housing deficit, the generational divide, and how the dream of home ownership in Australia has been systematically pulled out of reach for ordinary Aussies. We've shown you the raw stats and what the younger generations are also facing. It's not just inflation, not just interest rates, and definitely not about young people trying hard enough. What's happening in Australia's housing market isn't natural and it's not accidental. It's the result of decades of short-sighted policies and mass migration. And unfortunately, it's only getting worse. The Australian dream of working hard, buying a home, and building a life and family used to be real and achievable for Aussies. Now, for millions, it's almost a fairy tale. This isn't just about housing, it's also about the future of our country. And if enough people start telling the truth about why this crisis exists, change is still possible. So like and share the video to help make that happen. Consider checking out our merch, becoming a YouTube channel member or Patreon, links in the description, and check out one of the videos on screen now. God bless Australia, and Christ is King.